Hello, my name is Eric Hahn, and welcome to Shit. I Have to Teach in 20 Minutes, a podcast for history teachers and anyone who wants a quick dose of history. Thanks for joining us today. We're continuing to enjoy such great positive feedback from you, the listeners. And if you've been meaning to contact us, we'll let you know how later. In every episode, my colleague Rob Good and I interview a historian about their scholarship. We ask them to identify the most important concepts they think teachers should share with their students about the topic for the day. We also include a free lesson plan, almost always 2 lessons, that can be downloaded from the episode notes linked to this podcast. So, Rob, what is our focus for today?
Well, we are looking at the progressive period in the United States during the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. I know as a teacher, I was constantly changing my design for this unit because so much occurred in such a short period of time. I always wondered, how much should I address the economic changes of industry, the social developments linked to urbanization, immigration, gender, and race, the political realignment that occurred, imperial expansions in there, and then you've got these cultural developments such as the rise of new leisure and amusement parks, and then technologies like film and musical recordings. It's just a lot to do in just a few weeks.
You know, I share your sentiment about the design of the progressive era being covered in such a ridiculous, it's such a short amount of time for the curriculum. But even though it didn't seem like a particularly difficult portion of U.S. history to teach, somehow my students found it a contextually difficult topic to learn about. And that's probably my fault. Or maybe there are so many concurrent noted historical periods like you mentioned. I have a Gilded Age, Industrial Age, Suffragette, Civil Rights. Anyway, I'm rambling. So, Rob, who is our guest for this episode?
Well, first, it was your fault. Oh, but but today we are so excited to welcome Dr. Laura Westhoff. Laura is a professor and the former chair of the history department at the University of Missouri St. Louis. She's an expert on the progressive period, and her book, A Fatal Drifting Apart: Democratic Social Knowledge and Social Reform, provided me with considerable guidance on how to conceptualize this time period. Laura is also a committed advocate for K-12 history teachers, and she has led many, and I mean many, projects to help teachers, including the TAHA grants, National Endowment for the Humanities grants. Basically, anywhere Laura is, teachers are learning because of her commitment to the K-12 situation. And most importantly, she's a long-standing friend of ours, and she still agreed to join us, even though she knows us way too well.
Laura. Hi, Laura. We've known Laura for quite a while. Great to have you with us. Listeners, you are in for a treat. So, Laura, what would you say are the most important ideas about the progressive era that teachers should teach and students should learn or know regarding that time period? And just to kind of start us off, when was that time period, the progressive period?
Yes. Okay. Well, there's a lot of questions in that, Eric. But first, let me thank you both for having me on. It's really my privilege and my great honor to be here. So, when was the progressive era? So this is a loaded question for those of us who study the progressive era. I like to think of the progressive era as the long progressive era that really extends back into what we might call the Gilded Age and goes forward into the 20s and even into the Great Depression. And that periodization is largely because I'm interested in how ideas touch down into people's lives and into our policy, our economic lives, our social lives. And there aren't neat boundaries when you're talking about ideas and culture. And so much of what we see in the conceptualization of the progressive era goes back into the 19th century and even earlier and forward well into the 20th century. So with that long introduction to the periodization, the reason I would say that is because what we're really dealing with in this period is what those at the time would call the social question. And the social question wraps into it all of what Rob was saying in his introduction. Um, it's about how people live together in a society that has new technologies, new forms of labor, new peoples coming together in growing cities. It's an expansive concept, but it throws into the mix, how do we want to live together in an increasingly complex society? And so that shows up in a lot of ways. And the three concepts I would say around that are democracy. I suggest technology and innovation. And the third, we might consider that up for grabs. I guess I want to talk about education a little bit as well. And, as teachers develop their approach, you'll all find your own ways, but I think education is a good way to hook students. But democracy, technological innovations, and how people's lived experience, especially children, are changing during this period is pretty important.
Could you talk? I love how in your book you frame democracy around sort of social knowledge and this idea that people, Jane Addams' quote, that she's worried that people are drifting apart because of all of these changes. And you make democracy sort of an intimate and social knowledge. And I think a lot of teachers approach this with reform and state government and federal government changes, which I think are really important. But how would you suggest that teachers sort of try and make their discussion of democracy and that approach to reformers in trying to deal with democracy a little bit more complicated or complex?
Sure. So, right, the way that we teach, and when I was a middle school teacher a long time ago, and I taught this period, it is around politics, policy, and so on. But the complexity lies in the intellectual framework that we deal with as the United States, that is wrestling on the world stage, even in that period. And the push to understand democracy as something more than voting. And so many of the reformers that we see, I take the position as a progressive era scholar, and this is certainly up for debate in our scholarly community, but I see it as really important to understand that how we live together and what it means to really see people in our community as truly equal and worthy of the same kind of rights and privileges, and to feel responsibility for a society that creates those conditions. It's an ongoing project of the American nation, and much farther back of notions of not only democracy but just social life among humans. How do we live together humanely? And so that is what's driving a lot of the reforms, is looking at how the implications of changing conditions of life, economic, labor, living arrangements in cities, and so on. How can we organize in a fashion that really includes and uplifts more than we have in the past? And so we tend to think about the progressive era as, do more people have the vote before or after, or things like that? It's a period where we might suggest to students, in times of tremendous change, how can we imagine a society that we want? And I think that's what's on the table. And the biggest issue driving that in the progressive era is the Depression of 1893. I think really kind of throws out there, something's not working here. How are we going to imagine a response to this that is more humane than so. There's a lot of yeah. You got me talking too much here.
Well, no. So here's the question. Like, let me. You've actually, that's kind of provocative. Were there just to get to maybe some practical issues that teachers might face? Were there particular individuals who expanded that idea of democracy or expanded that idea of humanity? People living together, that sort of thing. I know there's probably a very long list, but if you were to take your top 3 or 5 people, who would they be?
Gosh, oh my goodness.
Terrible question.
I go always to Jane Addams, who is a contentious figure when I was coming up through graduate school. We might see the progressive era as one of like forcing Americanization on immigrants and so on. But deep reading into Jane Addams, who was very influenced by British European thinkers. So, there's this transatlantic relationship with the US and Europe in the progressive era. She, through her experience, both first as an educated woman, fairly, newish concept, and deciding not to marry and opening a house in a urban, congested immigrant neighborhood and inviting all people into the community. And it's sort of quaint that, she and her friend, partner Ellen Gates Starr thought, we'll just open our doors and people will flock to us. I mean, this is a sweet little notion, but she, through decades living the view that we need to be neighborly with each other, no matter what our circumstances are. There's a lot a teacher can mine in the life and the activities of Jane Addams and Hull House more generally, because so many famous people came through Hull House. So that is, you could use Jane Addams as a touchstone and not go wrong. You could use Ida Wells Barnett and look into her life as an African American woman growing up in the South, living in Memphis, doing her own, tests of segregation laws on transportation. She becomes a very critical voice of the sort of popular notion of the reasons for lynching. Her life and the people that she interacted with cut across so many issues as well: economics, race, structures of racial organizations to push for equal rights during the period. I can go on, Eric.
Well, can I? So, yeah. Well, and one question I have, because I'm looking at the time. One of the things you mentioned that you wanted to talk about was education, and I think both as a progressive era movement and the fact that we're talking with teachers that are dealing with issues in education even today. I don't want to suggest that John Dewey may have been one of those people on your list, but so could you mention or talk a little bit about education because those questions of assimilation, but also progressive and child-centered education sort of emerge at the same time.
Well, I'm actually going to take this in a little different direction, Rob.
Cool.
And absolutely, those are important. And I'm passionate about John Dewey child-centered education. But the progressive era is when we see the rise of compulsory education laws in most states. And the reason that might be important or helpful for teachers to think about with their students, one is to imagine, like, what is it to be a kid before you were required to go to school into your, adolescence. Maybe if you stopped going to school at age 11 or 12, 13, your life experience looks very different. So just the idea of what it means to be a child, and especially an adolescent, the concept of adolescence comes about in the progressive era. G. Stanley Hall, talks about this phase of life that isn't childhood and isn't adulthood. So the push for compulsory education, which comes from a group of weirdly connected bedfellows, the labor movement, and these very uptight, pristine reformers, mostly female reformers. There's a coalition to push for education that reflects changing notions of childhood, that reflects the changing conditions of labor. Why do these unions not want kids in the workplace? There's unions have a stake in wanting to keep kids in school. What does it mean to the kind of high school education one might receive, and delaying work? And, from that, you get this whole interesting thing around leisure time and the way schools become places where families spend, or students spend time together around sports and activities and so on. And then schools are places where immigrants come to learn how to speak English, to learn about American culture and so on. So there's, in thinking about what to bring and offer to teachers, I would say you teach the complexities by taking a concept, an example, and showing the complexities. And education is certainly one of those places.
Boy, that's such a great idea. And I just think from a meta standpoint too, that students, the idea of teenagers and adolescents was created at this moment, that they will sort of connect to that. And then it's just a moment that speaks to our time period now. We could have this comment. Oh my God, we're just going to have another follow up on the progressive era because this is so.
Well, you could do this whole podcast on why the progressive era is the only thing you ever need to teach.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Eric, did you have anything else that you wanted to ask?
Yes, I also want to thank Laura. Of course, we always want to thank our listeners. Remember, you can download your free lesson from the link provided in the episode notes. Be sure to stay tuned after this brief song to hear a description of those lessons.
Oh no, the clock is ticking, 20 minutes, time is spinning, pulling facts from thin air, hope to think I came prepared.
Laura did a wonderful job providing some guiding concepts to help organize this complex time period. The lesson I developed is built around our observations that the progressive era leaders saw democracy as much more than just voting. The question of how can we live together in a humane way during so much change is a question that is as relevant today as it was during the beginning of the 20th century. In the lesson, students read and analyze 4 different visions for democracy presented during the progressive period. They include perspectives from an African-American activist, a middle-class white reformer, a union leader, and a former U.S. president. Once they've analyzed all 4 documents, students are asked to select which one they think was the best vision for the time. Teachers can use student responses to encourage discussion on what is needed to promote a more humane and democratic society, both then and now.
That is a great lesson. And I also enjoyed Laura very much. Thanks again, Laura. And listeners, I am a big fan of John Dewey. So when Laura mentioned John Dewey, I was immediately attracted to that topic of progressives and education reforms. So students will learn about that. They'll watch, I think it's about an 11-minute video that really gives a pretty good overview, I think, of progressive era reforms in education. And then students will take a look at a couple of lists. One is on goals and reforms, and The other one is on principles and ideas of education in the progressive era, what has remained since that time and what has changed. And then students are asked to just write students will share ideas, and then perhaps collectively we'll think about ideas for current reforms needed in education. We know there are always many reforms needed. So that's the lesson that I hope some teachers find helpful.
It's great. And it's principals, PLES, not principals, PALS. Although I think I worked for some principals. I think there was some. I worked for some principals who had been there during the progressive period. No, it's a great lesson, and I think students will love looking at how students were treated or dealt with back in the day, and then the issues that they're dealing with. Yeah, I think it's a great lesson. Well, thank you for listening, and remember, you can download these free lessons from the link provided in the episode notes. And please be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts and on Instagram and YouTube. Eric will tell you how.
You can reach us for any feedback. Please do. We're enjoying any feedback that we do get. Questions or suggestions you might have about the conversations or lessons, lesson ideas, topic ideas at historyin20@gmail.com. Historyin20 is all one word. We'd love to hear from you, and thanks for joining us today.